Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Var Valley podcast. The word var is short for the French word varier, which means a person who varies. This channel is a spin-off of the History Valley podcast, which is where I spend much of my time interviewing mainstream scholars. Over here, however, I and the co-host of this channel, DJ Shonsky, interview a variety of alternative scholars who have radically different views from the mainstream. That being said, I'll provide the following disclaimer. I am not convinced by any of the people that are being interviewed here on Var Valley, and my views may not align with the views of DJ Shonsky. I am simply curious to figure out why they believe the things that they believe, and it does not represent my views in any way, shape, or form. Thank you. And today I'm joined by Sean and Professor Gunnar Heinsohn, and today we're going to be talking about a new chronology. Professor Gunnar Heinsohn argues that the mainstream timeline as we know it is very flawed, and in reality, the timeline is much shorter than we thought. Christianity started hundreds of years later than it is usually claimed by mainstream chronologists. And he not only gets into that in the AD period, but he also does a lot of work on the BC period and says the same thing is true for the BC time period as well. We have a lot of slides prepared today, so we're going to be going through a lot of them. And Sean will be taking the lead on the slides. So that being said, I'm going to give a brief introduction.
Disappeared again. It disappeared again.
Okay, I'm gonna give a brief introduction.
That's McGeefy. McGeefy wants to tell me ablehnen.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to call my son.
Okay. So while he gets through that technical difficulty, I'm going to give the brief introduction, and we should have that all finished by the time he gets back. Gunnar Heinsohn attended school in Oberkassel, Bonn, and St. Peter Ball, where he received his Abitur in 1964, where he studied at Free University Berlin, and also in 1964 as well. He graduated in 1971 in sociology and gained a 1974 summa cum laude doctorate in social sciences. Heinsohn received a second doctorate in economics in 1982. In 1984, Heinsohn became professor at the University of Bremen. He also founded the Raphael Lemkin Institute for Xenophobia und Genocidforschung. I apologize if I mispronounced that. A center for comparative research in genocide and xenophobia. He has published extensive articles on his arguments for a new chronology. He's done a lot of work on Paul and Jesus. He claims that Paul and Jesus lived in the 10th century CE and not in the 1st century CE. And that there was an apocalypse, a catastrophe, in our words, in the 10th century. And we're going to be getting into that today. All right. Thank you for joining us, Professor Heinsohn. My first question for you is, what would you say are the most important reasons in your research that you can think of that led you to the conclusion that the mainstream chronology is wrong?
In 2011, I was studying the end of the Western Roman Empire, the so-called 3rd century crisis. And I was studying at the same time the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's not that precisely dated, some when in the 6th or 7th century AD. And I came to the conclusion that nowhere you can find a single site out of the some 4,000 cities of the Roman Empire. You cannot find a single site in which you have a collapse of civilization in the 3rd century. Then you have a new beginning, and you have a second collapse of civilization in the 6th or 7th century. There's in the stratigraphy of any city we have researched, there's only one collapse. In 2013, so 2 years later, I came across the major study on the archaeology of Eastern Europe, which included Scandinavia and went all the way down to Mesopotamia, to modern Iraq. And there we have another end of civilization dated around 930 AD. Since I already knew that there is nowhere a stratigraphy that shows us 2 wipeouts of civilization, I already knew that there will nowhere be 3. So I came to the conclusion that all the 3 catastrophes, 3rd century crisis, 6th century crisis, 930s collapse, that they are all one and the same disaster that brought down the Roman civilization of Western Rome, of Eastern Rome, and of Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, the Arab countries in one hit. This brought the question, if we have a downfall of civilization in 930 in Eastern and Northern Europe, and we have another one in 230 in Rome. Remember, the last water pipe in Rome was built 226 AD under Alexander Severus, and then for 700 years there was no water pipe built again in that city, no latrines, no residentials, nothing. I had to decide how to date the final catastrophe, and the final catastrophe of Roman civilization. And I decided that the 930s date is the correct way to go. Why? Because after the 930s, we have the beginning of the High Middle Ages with the famous German Holy Roman Emperors. They were not called that way at that time, Otto I, Otto III, Otto I to Otto III. And if you count backwards from then, you end up in this catastrophe of the 930s. We even have a German or Germanic, whatever you call him, historian, Widukind of Corvey, who mentions that there were 2 comets and the mountains were exploding when the father of this first empire, Otto I, when his father, Henry the Fowler, had died. His death is put around 936, and somehow around that death, he mentions that there was a major catastrophe. So I decided to count from top down, and then I looked at Rome and I looked at Constantinople, and I said, what do we have for these cities? Let's start with Rome between 230 and 930. Can I put the date of 230 to 930? It sounds insane, right? It sounds quite crazy. And what I did was very simple. I looked for the basics: water pipes, toilets, food kitchens, residences. And there's consensus in mainstream that after the 230s, there are no latrines, no water pipes, no sewage canals, no streets built in Rome up to the 10th century. So I said, okay, that's fine. But then you may say, what about the churches in Rome? And here we come to one of the forgotten geniuses of Roman research. His name was Richard Krautheimer. He was expelled as a Jew from the German Archaeological Institute in Rome in 1934. And in 1942, in American exile, he wrote an article that's also mostly forgotten. And in this article, he wondered. Krautheimer wrote some 7 atlas-size volumes on all the churches of Rome. There was no person ever that knew more about the churches of Rome. He wondered that the Christian basilicas of the 4th century looked like pagan basilicas of the 1st century, that Christian basilicas of the 5th century looked like pagan basilicas of the 2nd century. But his wandering was not over. He also found that the Christian basilicas of the 8th century that looked like those of the 4th century and like those pagans of the 1st century. And then he found that the basilicas of the 9th century looked like the basilicas of the 5th century, that looked like basilicas of the pagans of the 2nd century. So he had 1, 4, 8, the same, 2, 5, 9, the same. And so I just asked one additional question. He may ask the question himself. I'm not sure if he did, but I asked myself, if these churches 259 or 148 were ever found in Rome on top of each other, one on the ruins of the earlier one. They never are found on top of each other. They're sitting at the same stratigraphic depth all over the city of Rome. So in stratigraphy, they are side by side. You see, has 3 fingers. They're side by side, but in the books, they're on top of each other. You see, so they are in a vertical sequence. In stratigraphy, they are in a horizontal line. So already we're clear: no toilets, no streets, no water pipes, no sewage, no kitchen. And now I could show that the churches of Rome, dated 4th, 5th, 8th, and 9th, belong to 1st and 2nd, and 1st and 2nd is the same as 8th and 9th. And so the same date I have for Eastern Europe, 930s, for the end of civilization, I also have for Rome. It's a bit complicated, but in a way it's quite simple.
Right. There are complexities to it, I agree, but it is quite simple, like you said. I'm very familiar with your work. A lot of people that are going to watch this video aren't very familiar with your work. So what you're saying essentially is there's no cultural advancement in Europe for some period of time, though the textbooks have everything laid out in a chronology that would sequence everything over the course of, let's say, 900 years or so, is what it sounds like you're saying.
It's like that, and that has a fallout. So if you have sources, material sources, 2nd, 5th, and 9th century, you have divided the sources that are stratigraphically at the same depths. You have divided them over 2nd, 5th, and 9th century. You have a piece of a narrative for the 2nd, a piece of a narrative of the 5th, and a piece of a narrative for the 9th century. So you have no complete image anywhere. So if I take out the time, I come to the point that I can, for the first time, write a reasonable history. So what does it mean, for example? Every learned person learns that the Christians were a strange bunch of people, because for the first 3 centuries, they decided not to have churches. So it's one of the great enigmas. And when they start building churches in the 4th century, they started to build churches in the 4th century in the style of the 1st century, when they have no churches, when they should have churches, because their godfather, so to speak, Jesus, was a person of the 1st century. So now I can explain that they were not that strange, that they built their churches from the very beginning, but that this beginning, 1st century, is the same as 4th and 8th century. And they had more sophisticated churches in the 2nd century, but they dated 5th and 9th century. So I can suddenly write the history of church building, and I can see the evolution in this history of church building. The great Richard Krautheimer thought there was one original, and then a first Renaissance, and then a second Renaissance. And I say no, there was only one period, 1st century and 2nd century, with evolution, of course. And we have the development of churches right in the time when we have the development of Christianity. So I give you another example for the capability to write history, where today people throw out material because it doesn't make sense. I want to mention St. Paul, that was brought up in the introduction. St. Paul is dated, his death is dated in the time of Emperor Nero in Rome, around 60 after Christ. And there are very, very learned people who claim that Paul has never existed. Why do they claim that? For very good reason. Apparently very good reason do they claim that. They said he is only known from his own writings, and most of his own writings are not his own writings. And secondly, he maybe still have been mentioned by 1 or 2 other Christian authors, but nobody in the outer world ever heard of him And it's very strange. His disciples are all over the empire. They have struggles, internal struggles. They have struggles with the authorities. And all these authorities never mention them. So these scholars, I knew some of them personally. Detering was the most famous, he died. They had very good reason to say Paul is an invention. I asked myself immediately, okay, if you have nothing about Paul and his followers outside his own Christian sources, what about in the 4th century? What about in the 8th century? And yes, in the 8th century, you have another Paul starting out of Antioch, as our Paul did. And the followers are called Paulinists or Paulicians. And in the 8th century, again, you have Paulicians, and they are persecuted heavily. And this we know from the Greek sources. So suddenly we have non-Christian sources that attest to the persecution, to the torture, to the killing of followers of Paul. So I bring together, again, sources that are hacked into 3 parts: 1st century, 4th century, 8th century. I said they're stratigraphically at the same depths. So I read them all together, and suddenly I can make sense of the history of St. Paul.
Okay, Sean,
Yes.
which slide section do you want me to pull up?
You can start with the first set of slides, and those are the ones he sent us, and we can just kind of briefly, because again, I've read this stuff. I have a great deal of respect and admiration for Professor Heinsohn. It would take a person and to have to really sit down and take some months to wrap their head around this and follow the yellow brick road or follow the trail of evidence. Gunnar uses several different disciplines to make his argument. So we can start with the slides.
Since we're talking about Paul, can you
yeah, that's the second set of slides. Let's go to the second set of slides. The second
I'll add that here.
Yes. And can I flick them, or can you?
Yeah, you can flip them. Yeah.
Right, so I'm going to flip down. I just put some other stuff together, Professor Heinsohn, from some other of your papers. This is the paper here. St. Paul, did he live once, thrice, or not at all? This is the paper that I got from QMag. Yep. And I think we did put QMag in the description link, qmag.org. And then the video Gunnar Heinsohn.
That's in Quantivolution magazine.
Yes, Quantivolution magazine.
This portrait of St. Paul was made by a German police department that usually is occupied with creating phantom images of a possible criminal that was seen by different persons, and they all make a sketch, and so the specialists, they try to come up with a reasonable portrait. The problem here we have that in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, and Paul himself in the 1st century, there are no images of this great world traveler. No portraits. Here you can see this. The portraits begin in the 3rd, 4th century. They are on the left side, the first 4 or 5, and then you have again a portrait of Paul on the right side in the 8th century. And if you look at the portrait carefully, you can see some similarity. So it looks as if at least one artist has seen St. Paul, but all these portraits are at least 200 years later than the death of Paul under Emperor Nero. So again, the Paul researcher said, this is all rubbish, we cannot use it. They don't belong to the time of Paul. And my answer again is, I understand your point. You cannot prove a man of the 1st century by showing a portrait of the 4th century. But if the 4th century and the 1st century are stratigraphically at the same plane, then you're looking at portraits out of the time of Paul, but we have to date him after the last portrait on the right side from the 8th century, because if I look at the last one, I'm doing the dating by counting from the top down. So I have a known date of the first Germanic emperors, Otto 1, 2, 3, and I go down, and then I end in the 8th century and not in the 1st century that we have in the chronology. That's 700 years earlier. And again, then we have the argument, do we have anything in Rome where Paul was executed between the 9th century and the 2nd century, or the 3rd and the 10th century? And again, we have no latrines, no streets, etc., etc.
Yeah, so this one here talks about the from the same paper, the artificial duplication of the Jewish wars against Rome's Legio Frantisius, if I'm pronouncing it correct, because a lot of times in your papers you're making a claim that there are duplications of and triplications even at times of historical accounts. The names may be changed, but then stratigraphically everything is here instead of here.
Yeah,
so
let's stay a second at Jerusalem. So we have the famous or the infamous war against the Jews, extermination of most of the Jews of their time, and it's the final date is put at something like 70 after Christ, and so then we have the same problem as in Rome. Why would the burial site or the mausoleum for Jesus be built or finished around 360 after Christ? Why would that be done? It's not well understood that Constantine the Great and his sons, including Constantius II, why would they build a burial for this Christian hero some 300 years or more than 300 years after his demise? And again, if we look at stratigraphy, we can see in Jerusalem that the Holy Sepulchre, what we call today the Holy Sepulchre, or since the 11th century, the Holy Sepulchre, is built on a Jewish quarry of the 1st century BC AD, not on something of the 4th century. But what is even more interesting is that the ashlars used to build the basilica and the round mausoleum of Jesus, these are ashlars of the 1st century BC and AD, Herodian ashlars. And so the stratigraphic evidence is that the burial site for Jesus was built in a 1st century stratum with 1st century stones in the 1st century in which he died. But we learn, no, this was all built in the 4th century against the stratigraphy and against the material evidence of the stones that had been used. So again, the question, why didn't the Christians build churches in the time of Christ, is repeated, and why didn't the Christians build a burial site for Jesus in the site of Christ? My answer is they did. They did, if we look at stratigraphy and put aside for the moment the Anno Domini chronology.
Right. Now I just went to the slide with the
very important slide.
Yeah, Temple Mount. This was something that because what Gunnar will do is he'll make the argument that things are dated in such a way where there's huge gaps in between the dating, but when you use your eyes and just look, the materials look the same, structures look the same, but yet we have these very long gaps in history. This is another very important slide. This is the Temple Mount.
It's the western wall of the Temple Mount.
Dr. Heinsohn, what was the catastrophe that what caused the catastrophe in the 10th century? That's my question.
I have only a speculation. Okay. Why do I only have a speculation? Because I would have to move into the sphere of astrophysics, and I'm not an expert in astrophysics. But I can tell you two things. One I already mentioned. It was Widukind of Corvey, the Saxon Germanic historian, who wrote in the 10th century and who told us that there were two comets, or a double-headed comet, it's not quite clear, in the time of the death of Henry the Fowler, the father of the first Germanic Roman emperor, Otto I. That's a written source. And so these comets have occupied me because they are never dealt with in the history of the 10th century. So they're mentioned somehow, they're not hidden. The source is there, the source is online, everybody can read it. But I connected this source with material that is found all over the world. It's found on the last Roman strata. If you date them 3rd century or 10th century, it doesn't make a difference. It's called black earth, dark soil, in German dunkler Moder, in Italian fango, which is mud. You have this fango, this mud, on the Broom clean Forum of Rome. And I give another example. You have it in the territory of London, in 2 sites of the territory of London. One is called Londinium in Latin, and one is called Lundenwic. And in Londinium, the black earth that covers the Roman side is dated 230s after Christ. 1.5 kilometers to the west in Lundenwic, the same dark earth is dated 930 after Christ, 700 years apart. But the people of 930, they used the same streets that in Lundenwic, they used the same streets that the people of Londinium, 1500 meters to the east, used 700 years earlier. These streets were absolutely impeccable for 700 years. Again, I propose to look at the stratigraphy of these 2 sites, just 1500 meters apart, and then you have the dark earth falling at the same time around 930s. So that's one of the materials. The geologists have found what they call the younger alluvial fill. That's
Jacob, I'm sorry, Dr. Heinsohn. Go to the first set of slides, Jacob, and I'll flip through them as he's speaking. Continue. Go ahead.
It's called the first alluvial fill, and you find it in valleys. And in the Earth's geology, we only know of 2 alluvial fills. The first one is dated around 10,000 BCE. I do not believe in that date, but I do not challenge it at this occasion. And that's the alluvial fill tied to the flood stories that we have in the Hebrew sources and in cuneiform sources, etc., etc. And then there is a second fill, and above many times in the same places, and it's a real extra separate stratum on the first fill. And the second fill makes difficulties of dating. In one place, it's always upon Roman material. In one place, it's in the 3rd century. In another place, it's in the 6th century. And again, in another place, it's in the 10th century. But the geologists that were occupied with it, they never found 3 such deluge-like catastrophes on top of each other, 3rd century, 6th century, 10th century. They're vertically in the same plane, and there's only one fill. But these geologists believe in Anno Domini chronology, so they have to do what they do. They say, we have this second alluvian fill, a deluge kind of fill, and it's running through the first millennium after Christ, 3rd, 6th, 7th, and 10th century, and I say stratigraphically it's all 10th century. So there's material that came down, right? And if you want to have a catastrophe that brings down material and does not repeat itself on a regular basis, you would like to have a comet crossing the orbit of the Earth, losing material, and by losing material, slightly changing its course that it cannot hit another time. So that would be my not my explanation. I don't dare to call it an explanation. It's a brutal speculation. That's all it is.
I would like to make a comment. The alluvial fill is a geological term, and some other principles within the Thunderbolts group. We've talked about this, and with this piano antico, the fango, which is the dark earth, and the bonifica, which looks like fill, it would seem, from our understanding, that in the valleys where there's alluvial fill, it's flipped, where you would have the silt on the top. I'm not sure about the dark earth at all, but the heavier fill would be underneath the silt. And it seems that in this case, the lighter material is on the bottom. There's this dark earth that it's really hard to explain in the middle. Then you have fill on the top. In other words, it's still a younger alluvial fill on top of buildings where it doesn't belong. And there really is no explanation. I was never given an explanation for these things growing up in the public school system, nor did I even know that the layers look this way. Even with this dark earth enigma, there's a recent excavation in the UK. They're building a high-speed line, and they stopped because there's an archaeological site there. And what are they excavating but this fongo, this dark earth? And they find Roman artifacts. And this article is only on the top layer of strata, mind you. It's not very deep beneath the surface. This is an article from 3 months ago. So these points are points that I had never seen in the public school system or even at university. I never knew that.
If you go back to the slide a second, you see something strange. You see the floor of the Roman Forum. It's a Forum of Traian. So that's broomed, that's clean. And so whenever you date it, 230s or 600, I don't care, the fango by the Roman excavators, this photo was published 2017 only, is dated 9th, 10th century. So that's my 930 fallout of the catastrophe. And there's nothing from the floor of the forum up to 930. There's just nothing there. So that's stratigraphically a very important testimony we have here before our eyes, that although the Forum of Traian was built around 100, 110 after Christ, and it was used, of course, for at least to the 230s when we have the 3rd century crisis. But then we don't know much about this Forum of Traian. And suddenly, around 900, 930, as I say, we have this flood of material covering the city.
Right. When would you date the Ostrogoth invasion of Rome? Because, and as you know, that they'll say that Odoacer Flavius conquered Rome, and he was an Ostrogoth. When does that date?
I understand the question. So before the final catastrophe, dated 3rd century, 6th century, 10th century, I date all of them 10th century stratigraphically. Before we have the crisis of Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus, when we had a plague and the very mysterious Antonine fires. In this fire, dated 192 after Christ, the state archive of Rome was burned down. So Rome at that moment had lost its memory. And I take this date around the 190s as the date for the so-called migrations. So the empire is shattered. The provinces cannot be controlled from the capital. The capital is emasculated in a way. It is said that these fires had to consume themselves. You could not extinguish the fires, and that the fires were accompanied by 40 hits of an earthquake. So it's quite mysterious, but the evidence is there. So at that time, Marcus Aurelius tells us this story, two very dangerous tribes enter Italy. One they call the Quadi, and the other one they call the Iazyges. And the Quadi and the Iazyges, dated to the 190s, they are considered by the specialists as proto-Huns and proto-Gothic people. So we learn that Theodoric and the Ostrogoths entered Italy some 300 years later, 480, you see. And then we talk of Huns and the Gothic nation. In the 2nd century, we talk of proto-Huns and proto-Goths. So proto-Goths were called Quadi, and proto-Huns, they were called Iazyges. They have the same ornaments, the same brooches, etc., over these two periods of 300 years. But you never ever find Gothic material like in Ravenna of 500 after Christ on top of a Quadi material of 200 after Christ. But we know that the Quadi were settled around Ravenna around 100 in the 190s by earlier still by Commodus in the 180s, or even by Marcus Aurelius 180s. They were allowed to settle around Ravenna, whereas the Yazouks were described as too cruel or too Asiatic to get the same privilege as these Quadi. And I say these proto-Huns and these proto-Goths, Yazouks and Quadi, are the same as Huns and Goths. And I jump to the 9th. What do you have for them in the 9th century? Then they're called the Huns and the Vikings. There's these three couples, Huns and Vikings, 9th century, 5th, 6th century, Huns and Goths, and 2nd century Quadi and Yazouks, I think, are just three different descriptions of the same people. Stratigraphically, they're all in the same plane.
Am I correct that you move Emperor Constantine's reign to the 1st century?
Yes.
Why do you do that?
Why do I do that? Because if you look, if you study stratigraphically, we have a wonderful research on the mausoleum of the nemesis of Constantine. This is Maxentius. That's the emperor. Yeah, go back. Yeah, right
Okay.
there.
Right.
Maxentius is the emperor. Now one slide back. The other, maybe the other direction. Okay, stay here.
Okay.
So on the left side, you see the mausoleum of Maxentius, who was defeated by Constantine at the Milvian Bridge. That battle is dated 311 after Christ, 311 after Christ. Now, if you look at this mausoleum, you see the perimeter wall, the outer wall, and in this wall, you see cut into these walls smaller mausoleums, smaller tombs. And if you go to the bottom tomb, that is cut in the perimeter wall, that only 7 centimeters of this surrounding wall is left. So they cut this little mausoleum into the outer wall to stabilize it. And this mausoleum is dated before 550 after Christ. So the wall is dated 310 after Christ, but the mausoleum cut into the wall is dated before 50 after Christ. So that's a stratigraphic proof that this mausoleum must be from the first half of the 1st century after Christ. But we go back to Jerusalem, we have the same problem. Here we have a building by Maxentius, the enemy of Constantine. In Jerusalem, we have the Jesus mausoleum built by Constantine and his son and his sons around 320, 30s to 360 after Christ in mainstream chronology. But these buildings, it's a wonderful basilica in the style of the 1st century in Rome, dated in the 4th century in Jerusalem. And the ashlars, the very peculiar ashlars, have the style of the Herodian Hebrew Jewish kings' ashlars of the 1st century BC AD. This is not disputed. The ashlars in the 1st century are not disputed, and the stratum in the 1st century AD is neither disputed. Only the date, I give my date, which is around 40 to 60 AD. My date is disputed by the AD chronology, because they say we cannot follow stratigraphy, we cannot follow the hard evidence, we have to follow the chronology. We do not understand, but we have it since nearly 1,000 years. And the chronology is all we have. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but if I would interpret, so my colleagues say we have only one dogma. We are very good scholars, and they are, but the chronology is holy. Don't touch the chronology.
Right. This is basically an argument of chronology versus empirical evidence and the investigation of the empirical evidence and strata. Let the strata tell the story and not rely on the story. It's just the way I kind of say it to people.
Can we go back to the western wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem?
Yes.
Because I was interrupted by the very important question regarding the character of the catastrophe.
Yes.
It's
Jacob. That's the second set of slides, Jacob. Here we go.
Exactly that. So what you see here is the first 7 courses of ashlars. They are dated from 19 BC. Actually, they are ended after the death of Herodotus. They're not so important, maybe 20 after Christ, okay? And then right on top, we have the Arab ashlars of the Umayyads of the 7th and 8th century, right on top. Mm-hmm. So and if you look at these ashlars carefully, you would say, okay, not that many differences. But what you learn at the same time is that the Arabs were not able to issue coins for at least 600 years. They forgot the ability to issue coins. They issued coins. The Nabatean Arabs living around Jerusalem, they issued their own coins. And then they forgot to issue coins. And when they restarted issuing coins 600 years later, they just continued with the decourse of 600 years before, when they had forgotten to issue coins. My claim is the Arabs did not forget for some 600 or more years. They did not forget to issue coins. What we have done is we have put archaeologically empty centuries between the Nabatean Arab coins and the Umayyad Arab coins. But that's not the interesting story I want to tell you. When you learn that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, you learn that they razed the city and that the city lay waste, at least up to the time of Emperor Hadrian, for 60 years. But if you look carefully at who conquered Jerusalem, the high commander, he was an Italian in modern language, but the troops were all Arabs. You see, the Romans would recruit the soldiers where they lived. It was so Jerusalem was not destroyed by Italians. It was destroyed by Arabs. And this is well known because we have tombstones of officers of the legion that destroyed Jerusalem. So we have one big problem here. If Arabs in the service of Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 after Christ, why would they wait for 600 years to live in the city? Why would they do that? I get no answer to this question. But if I look at what these Arabs 600 years later use, it's on the right side here, it's a floor, a mosaic floor with this abstracted peacock pattern. So that's dated around 700, 800, 690, not so precise. Right. And at the left side, the model is from Pompeii. That's 1st century after Christ. So these mosaics are 600 to 700 years apart. So if the Nabateans, whose soldiers conquered Jerusalem, are the same as the Umayyads, then we understand that the Arabs moved right into Jerusalem after they conquered it. That's why the Arab ashlars sit right on the Herodian ashlars on the western wall. That's why the Arabs use the same mosaics, or if you go down, that's why the Arabs use the same Millefiori glass and the same glass bottles. They're put 700 years apart, and you cannot tell the difference. You can see that these glass items were even made in the same workshop. The same here, you have this Millefiori glass. It's a very sophisticated item. and you have it in the 1st century, and then you have it again in the 8th century. Today we do a very strange, we deal in a very strange way with the Arabs. We say, okay, you forgot to issue coins, you forgot to write, you forgot to make glass like this, you forgot everything. So that's a bit denigrating. But then suddenly we say, but 700 years later, you were geniuses. You saved civilization. You saved the Roman writings and the Greek writings. But it's not so much of a compliment. Why didn't they do their own writing, their own books on astronomy? And so why would they use the Greek and the Roman texts? So in reality, if you take out these 600 or 700 years here, the Arabs and the Romans and the Greeks were living side by side, and they were exchanging their scholarly ideas at the same time. And the Arabs were part of high civilization in the 2nd century and in the 1st century. They did not show up in the 7th or 8th century and were ignorant for the centuries in between. Not at all. I regard them as active partners in Roman civilization. And if it comes to these wonderful colored glass items, I think there are Arab inventions and Israeli inventions, because these glass workshops are found all along the Levant in today's Israel and today's Lebanon.
Right. That's wow. I mean, I have some more slides. They're not in any particular order. I pulled them just from different papers that you've written. Here we have
That's an interesting point. Again,
yeah.
You see on the left side, you see floor tiles that were found in the debris of the Herodian temple. So these are opus sextile tiles, floor tiles. And we have very similar floor tiles in Germany, in Aachen, 700 years later, in the capital of Charlemagne. Let me say a word of Charlemagne. So every child today learns that he was crowned emperor 800 years after Christ. But he himself did not know that. Nobody that I know of, not a single emperor, and I'm not demanding this from the pagan emperors, but if I look at the Christian emperors, I don't know, in the 1st millennium, I don't know a single Christian emperor who could say, I'm emperor so and so many years after Christ. They did not know this. We know this exactly down to the year. And we know this since quite a long time, 11th, 12th century, we started to put together these chronologies. So when there were no scholarly and scientific means to test these years, so it's important to remember they did not know. And one more thing, if we study the early Middle Ages, 8th century to 10th century, exactly 700 to 930, we say still it's a dark age, but then there are some wonderful exceptions, like Aachen, the palatial complex in Aachen, or like cities in Bulgaria, Pliska, Pleskov. They look like 2nd century Roman cities. The same style, the same material, the same types of marble, the same types of covering the brick walls with marble tiles to hide the bricks, etc. All 700 years apart, and it's again considered as a miracle. How could Charles, the great Charlemagne, how could he force, and there are no orders that he force his architect to build exactly as it was built 700 years before him? They would have had to become archaeologists. They would have had to become chemists, because down to the chemical fingerprint, the colors used in Germany in the 9th century for painting the walls have the same chemical fingerprint as the colors used in the walls of Rome in the 2nd century. So again, if you look at them stratigraphically, they sit in the same stratigraphic depth, and no miracle has to be invoked to explain the identity of the color pigments.
Right. I've tried to explain this to people for years. It almost is common sense, but it's not so common. I wish the textbooks in the United States would teach this because there would be no dark ages. I never understood why the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, that the West fell, but we don't have records, but we're going to teach you what happened, but we didn't have the records. And it never really made sense. It was very confusing. This was a 35-year-old problem for me until I started reading this information. It started to clear things up, and it would make much more common sense that Islam and Christianity were contemporary with each other. It would just make much more common sense rather than some 700 years or so later. Now, we do have other slides. I wanted you to touch on the BCE stuff a little bit. There's a lot to the first millennium, but then there's
I find that fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also some things when we talk about disasters and biblical theology. There's a lot here. There's a lot, ladies and gentlemen in the audience.
I started with pre-Christian chronology in 1988 on my own when I separated from Velikovsky. I try to make a simple point that people can follow. If you write a chronology, let's say for a territory stretching from Italy to India, or even from Spain to India, you try to look for one item, one nation is the best, that has relations east, west, north, and south. And when you have dated this nation correctly, then you have dated the nations to which they wrote letters, dated correctly too. So that's the trick to do here. And the nation I'm talking about is called the Mitanni. The Mitanni were not known up to the 1870s. Up to the late 19th century, nobody had ever heard about the Mitanni. These were Indo-Aryan horse breeders. Up to the late 19th century, every learned person of course had heard about the Medes, M-E-D-E-S, the Medes, also Indo-Aryan horse breeders. They were dated by Greek chronology that we know from Herodotus. So they were dated around 600 before Christ. And they were famous for having brought down what by Herodotus is called the empire of the Assyrians under the first world ruler under the name of Ninos. And so this was the learned wisdom. These Indo-Aryan horse breeders come to dominate the Near East around 600 before Christ. Then we began the excavations, and in the 19th century, and people found a peculiar cuneiform alphabet that was not Semitic. So there was the problem to date it, to call it and to give it a name and to date it. And the name was given by a great German Jewish scholar, Jules Aubert. He lived in the 19th century, so he was not expelled. He moved to France and lived in France. And he called this nation, we now call the Sumerians, he called them Proto-Chaldeans. Why Proto-Chaldeans? Chaldeans in antiquity were known as the sagest, as the most educated nation. So the Greeks wrote in their own books that they learned mathematics from the Chaldeans. Mm-hmm. So today we learn that these Chaldeans have never existed. But exactly where they have lived and where they had cities and where we know even the names of their cities, we found the civilization of the Sumerians. The interesting point now is that the Sumerians, in their own language, they call themselves the land of Kal. So they call themselves Chaldeans. And it goes further. We have so-called bilingual tablets. On one side, you have a Greek text, transliteration, not translation, but transliteration. And on the other side, you have a Sumerian, so-called Sumerian text that I call a Chaldean text. So today we laugh about the Greeks. They never heard about the Sumerians. They were so stupid. They were writing the language of the Sumerians, and on the other side, transliteration in Greek. They were too stupid to know what they were talking about. They were always telling these idiocies about the Chaldeans that never existed. Okay, so what happened to the Chaldeans also happened to their contemporaries, the Medes. The Medes are eliminated from our textbooks, and the Chaldeans are eliminated from our textbooks, but we are proud we have much older Mitanni and Sumerians. Now, the Mitanni have written letters to Egypt. The Mitanni had personnel in Israel, in Megiddo. The Mitanni had written letters to Asia Minor. The Mitanni had written letters to what is today Persia, to Elam. So the Mitanni are that nation that can date the entire Near East if we properly date that nation. I say the Mitanni are none other than the Medes that are eliminated from our textbooks. And the Mitanni, in the Mitanni time, the Pharaoh in Egypt receives letters that there are dangerous people in Israel, what we now call Israel. They were called Habiru, and they were dated around 1400, a little later than 1400 before Christ. And their leaders are called Dadua and Yeshua. And now an Englishman by the name David Roll, he claimed, and I think was all due right, that these Habiru under Dadua and Yeshua are none other than the Hebrews under David and Yeshua, his father. But as the Mitanni date as 1400 before Christ are not stratigraphic datas, neither was David Roll. So he believed in the date of David, which in the Bible is the date 1000 before Christ. So what he did was to put the Mitanni a little later, from 1400 before Christ to around 1000 before Christ. But then we have the great Israel Finkelstein, archaeologist in Israel. He said, there's nothing there in Jerusalem around the time of 1000. And he went so far to claim that there was no David, there was no kingdom of David. And that's a stark statement if we have the text, not only in the Bible, but the text about these Habiru under Dadua and Yeshua. And so Finkelstein said, oh, that's by chance. I cannot do anything about it. But what Finkelstein saw was that the special capitals on the top of columns that are called Aeolian capitals, and in Israel we call them Proto-Aeolian because we date them 1000 before Christ and not as everywhere else 600 before Christ. He discovered that they may be out of the time of 600 before Christ. And now you have just to add 2 plus 2. 600 before Christ, we have the Medes. We have the Medes. And if the Medes are the Mitanni, we have David and his father Yeshai in the time of the Medes. So they exist, and we cannot throw them out of the history books because of 2 wrong datings. 1400 for the Mitanni, that are the Medes of 600, and 1000 for David, who lives in the time of the Medes of the Mitanni in 600 BCE. And now we come to the final point of this. The Mitanni are brought down by another Indo-Aryan. His name was Atsiru. And the Medes are brought down by another famous Indo-Aryan, and his name was Cyrus. And I claim that Azero dated in the 14th century BC and Cyrus dated in the 6th century BC are one and the same person. So we have found the Medes, they go back into our history books. We have found their contemporaries, the Chaldeans, the Sumerians, go back into the history books. And we keep David and Yeshai in the history books too. And we cannot throw them out just because the biblical date for David is wrong. The date is secondary. The story is primary, especially if the story is repeated in the Amarna letters with the Habiru and Yeshai and Daduda, Yeshua and Daduda, Yeshai and David. Okay, so much to the history of ancient Israel.
Yeah, that was. I mean, I didn't put some of the slides. I'm hearing what you're saying, and I didn't put the slides up. But essentially, if there's a duplication or triplication of the chronology to take it back too far into the third millennium, when everything was excavated, to make it simple, the archaeology was placed into the older chronology, so that when you got into the first millennium BC, you ran out of archaeology, so you couldn't account for the Medes. Right, you couldn't account for the Medes, and so you have to start in the Chaldeans. So it was it 1869 or so, the Sumerians became.
Sean, you were saying you didn't pull up the slides, or
I didn't put what he was saying. There's some columns and there's some other slides.
You want to go ahead and put that up here?
Well, no, meaning I didn't even put them into
the you can take the other side on the history of Jerusalem. So I just make it the first you showed after.
Okay.
Go back. Yeah, stay here.
Okay.
Stay here.
All right.
So what we have in the Hebrew Bible is an exceptional book because it's national history, including world history of the known world of the time. And it's also a book dealing with religious matters. But the point for history writing is, of course, the history of Israel, of Judah, of the neighboring nations. And what modern scholars do, it's a very simple thing they do, and they do it in good faith. They take the date of the story in the Bible, David's story, 1000 before Christ. Then they look at an archaeological site, let's say Jerusalem, and they say, we do not find anything at 1000, and then they throw out the story. So I would say, yes, the chronology of the Hebrew Bible is wrong. The history is not wrong. So I deal with this period, first millennium before Christ, as I deal with the first millennium after Christ. You cannot throw out the stories because you believe in a peculiar date that you do not understand, that you just believe, and then you look at that date, and then you have the story and the date of the archaeological item, and the story don't fit, and you throw out the story. So you eliminate history. And what I try to do is write history for the first time in many fields, not in every field, but in many fields, by bringing the archaeological and the textual sources together and keep the dating at the side for the moment. Right. Don't throw out the story because it doesn't fit your dating. And that's what biblical archaeology is doing. Because the Israeli scholars, now I go back to first millennium after Christ, they believe in the same Anno Domini Christian chronology as their Christian colleagues. So they have no way to criticize each other because they have the same dogma.
Okay, we have a super chat question. Thank you for the $10. Eternal Berkshire's Ben with your questioning of dates. Where do you put Islam, Muhammad, and the Quran? And do you believe the Quran came from Mecca or Petra? Go Red Sox.
So the so-called Luxembourg school, a school of German Arabists, they established long ago that the oldest text of the Quran are Aramaic texts from the 1st century after Christ. But they believe in mainstream chronology, so they say they took 1st century after Christ texts to write their the Quran probably was written around 800, 900. They took 1st century material to write a book in the 9th century. And I think the book or the elements that form the Quranic book were around in the 1st century after Christ, which means in the time in which Arabs under Roman coats of arms occupy Jerusalem and make Jerusalem their center. The biggest building built in Jerusalem after the destruction of the Herodian temple are Arab buildings. We must not forget that these famous Umayyad palaces at the southern and western wall of the Temple Mount, enormous buildings that were just wiped out. We did not know about them until the 1970s when they were discovered by Israeli archaeologists, because they were wiped out in the 930s catastrophe. So when we think about that the Muslims first prayed to Jerusalem, so I say, yes, that's the time in which it was the first texts were put together, where they originated. And that's the time where Islam originated. But the date we learn about Islam around 700, 800, it's closer to the truth than the date we have for Jesus. Yeah, because stratigraphically, Jesus moves up to the 8th century, beginning of the 8th century, and his mausoleum, built by Constantine, stratigraphically 1st century, but in our chronology that counts from the top down, it's some time after 700, 730, 740. So we can see that Islam develops parallel to Christianity. And I go a step further. I think if I look at the earliest Umayyad coins, the Jewish candelabra, the 7 arm candelabra, I assume, and that's a speculation. I call it a speculation.
We have another question.
That Islam of the Umayyads develops as an attempt to keep Judaism alive after the Jews were mostly killed, wiped out by the Romans, which means under Roman leadership, by help, of course, of Arab soldiers that were doing, in quotation marks, their duty as Roman soldiers.
We have a super chat question from Chris Tenholm. Thank you for the 20 Canadian dollars. Biggest rabbit hole I've seen for a while. Is Gunnar planning an ebook?
You see, at the age of nearly 80, I have a 600 pages German manuscript, and it's at the stage of 2018, 4 years old, because only in 2017 I understood the correct chronology of Emperor Justinian, who left us the most important legacy of antiquity, which is the Roman law, of course. And after I understood that Justinian and the Severan emperors, Septimius Severus up to Alexander Severus, were contemporaries, were living more or less in the same buildings, visiting the same circus, swimming in the same thermal baths. Since 2018, I'm planning to finalize, not rewrite the German manuscript, but it needs a work over that may take a month or two. I haven't done that, but whoever wants to get this manuscript all the parts in the manuscript that deal with Justinian, I already made a note on the page how I date him. So you can use the manuscript. You can throw it into into a translation machine and look at it. Just write to me. I don't charge for it. I'm not at my age. I'm not hiding anything.
We have another super chat from Yehuda Ben Yisrael. Thank you for the $10. Well, what do you think about the temple in Arad being David's tabernacle, seeing it as the only temple found in the land of Israel?
I have no informed opinion. I read about it, and so I cannot support or contradict a position in that field. I'm sorry.
That's fine. We have one more super chat for now from the same person. Thank you for the $5. The only temple that dates back to the time of David. Okay, it looks like it's a continuation of the previous question.
If you don't mind, if I
no, wait a second. Right.
Take the
In
screen
the time, in the Mitanni time, if you go back to the slide, it's for me too small with my deteriorating eyesight.
Take it down. My fault.
There is a temple in Jerusalem in the time of the Mitanni, and it belongs to the Jebusites. There's a Jebusite. No one. That's the Exodus. No, that's right here.
All right.
So if you find the time to look at that slide, you will see that in the time when the Habiru under Dadua and Yeshua tried to conquer Jerusalem, the time of Cheba, the city is ruled by a Cheba. That's why I say 1400 BC dated. That's the Jebusites, the Jebusites. Then in that time you have a temple in Jerusalem. The ruins were found. I have no idea what was done with this temple when the Habiru, the Hebrew, took over the city. I have no idea. And I think I have to say I never thought about the question, what happened to this temple? You bring me to think about this for the first time.
Excellent.
But there was a temple, and a city wall.
I'm going to go backwards because we were talking about Finkelstein and Silberman. So if David is being dated to 1000 BCE, essentially, and when I was reading Pillars of the Past from Charles Jananthal, it says that, well, they didn't have the evidence in Jerusalem for David in 1000 BCE, so they went to Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor, cities that Solomon essentially founded or fortified. Well, there wasn't any evidence there, but then the gates of the city were dated as being newer. So that raises the question, with everything we're talking about, I know we're trying to condense it, the dating of the Bronze Age to the Iron Age in the first place. And you being a nerd for stratigraphy, and you've turned me into one, we're pushing essentially the dating of the Bronze Age forward in some cases. I know it was mentioned between you, Emmett Sweeney, and Lynn Rose. You're pushing the dates of the Bronze Age forward, which would push David forward a little bit, and then the Iron Age would start later, 600 BCE, or as you've said,
around that. So
right.
if the Mitanni are the Medes, and this Indo-Aryan nation starts to rule in, we call it, in a Semitic environment in the Near East, I think that date is correlated with the end of the Bronze Age. So if we give it the Greek date of Herodotus, we are around 600 BCE. But I have to add a caveat. If we look from 600 BC to 0 or to 180 under Emperor Augustus, within that period of 600 years, wherever we look, whatever city I have looked, I have to be careful here, I cannot cover a full 600 years. I may be able to cover some 400 years with hard evidence. So even for the time from 600 BC to 180, we may have 200 years that have no archaeology. And this is very, very well shown for Rome. And I think you can also show it, but I don't go into that now. For Jerusalem, when people talk about the temple periods, and they show the material for that time dating after 1000 BC, it's very little they have to show. And I think if you look at the finest stratigraphies in the city of Jerusalem, and you only take into account what's really there, then you will have something like 400 BC, but you have to be careful now. And then of AD, you have to take out 700 years. So altogether, from 600 BC to 1000 AD, you take out some 1100 years.
Right.
Sorry, some 900 years, not 11.
There's
700 plus 200.
Here,
yeah.
Like this slide here.
Yeah.
Though it talks about the Exodus, Cataclysm, and 6 disasters being one and the same from written sources. It's the timeline of years since the old Akkadians, kind of walking backwards, and it gives a pretty general summary of what you're.
Yeah, you look at it. Maybe one more point. So, since the Hebrew Bible was more or less the only history book mankind had for such a long time, all the mistakes of chronology in that book had to be adopted by anybody who became a historian. And so this chronology is now held against the book. And I say, don't hold the chronology against the book, hold the book against the chronology. Mm-hmm. And check the book against the stratigraphy. Forget the chronology for the timing, check the book against the stratigraphy. And if we look at the beginning of the terminology for the Bronze Age, it was developed by Danish scholars. Jakob Burse was one of them. And they had the beginning of the Bronze Age in Northern Europe in 1000 BC, at the beginning of the Iron Age in 600 BC. Today, without 1 centimeter of stratigraphy added in Northern Europe, we start 3000 BC with the Bronze Age. We added 2000 years without adding 1 centimeter of stratigraphy. To meet the date we have received more or less from the Bible, or exactly via Abraham the patriarch. So Abraham the patriarch dated everything openly up to the early 20th century. So when you read a chronology of BC times, so people were happy to start with Abraham. Later, they throw Abraham out because they felt embarrassed that they used the biblical figure, but they kept his date. They didn't change his date. So it's quite an awkward procedure they used. So in a way, we're still dealing with Abraham chronology without calling it Abraham chronology. Right, and again, we are throwing out Hebrew and other history because it doesn't, the stratigraphy doesn't fit biblical chronology, but biblical history, I think, quite well.
Right. Jacob, you hear, I've tried to repeat this over the last several years, and it's better to get it directly from Professor Heinsohn than me. I'm the middleman. Now we are blessed to have him here so he can just say it and break it down. I wish I had more slides. We still have the slides that you sent from the Cataclysm in the 10th century. I just wanted you to touch on this because, I've read these things over the past 7 years or so, going through the Velikovsky rabbit hole, and I meticulously read a lot. And this is what stuck with me and seems the most relevant to today's conversation. And to me, what's most important, based on how we're taught history and the history of religions, especially in the United States, this seems to be more important than some of the other things that we've gotten from the Velikovsky paradigm, et cetera. I just wanted to make that as a comment. Though I do have the slides. Would you like to talk about some of the slides that?
Sure. Okay. Go ahead. When I'm tiring and losing my speech, you will recognize.
Okay. You can go back to the first set of slides, Jacob, and we'll just kind of hit some bullet points because we're going back to the first millennium, because there's some pictures of Rome in strata that I've never seen. And I've read the papers, but you had some aqueducts. That's something that me and Michael Armstrong from the Thunderbolt group talk about a lot, where aqueducts were buried with 7 meters and sometimes 15 meters here, and people forgot about aqueducts. And the barbarians from the story from the early part of antiquity couldn't have destroyed the aqueducts. I heard that story growing up. And well, there are the aqueducts, and nobody's building aqueducts. And like you say, there's no latrines, and the civilization.
Let's stay here.
Yeah,
Maybe go back. So we look here at at the seashore.
Right here.
Go back one, and again. Where did you have the coastline of Rome?
Oh, okay. I know.
Okay.
Let me go forward. I know what you're talking about. Hold up. The coastline. I think I know exactly where you're going. Right here.
Yeah. Okay. So what you see here is on the left, you see a reconstruction of Rome's main two ports. One is called Ostia, the left image on the slide, and the right city is Ostia, and the left port is Porto. And today you have 4 kilometers of land in front of these ports. So you go to the right slide, and what you see in light blue, that's land today. That's not water. So the Roman ports had been moved 4 kilometers away from the water. If you go to the main port on the Adriatic side to Ravenna, Ravenna was moved away 7 to 9 kilometers away from the Adriatic Sea. So if you try to explain this, it's very difficult, because if it's a tsunami that brings material, then you may expect such a development on the western coast of Italy, but you have the same situation on the eastern coast of Italy. And if you go further down in Italy and look at the Roman Navy ports in the Bay of Naples, they are under the water. So two ports groups are away from the sea, and another port is under the water. So the geological process that can do this in a way to bend the coastlines down, up and further down, bend it down. It's very difficult even to imagine how you can reach such a result in today's landscape of Italy. So it must have been quite something quite very big. When I first talked to specialists in the field about the destruction of the big cities like Rome or whatever, they usually said it was done by the Germanic tribes, by the Germans. And but the smarter ones, when they gave the answer, they did it with a tongue in cheek, with a smile on the face, that told me that's the only answer we know. I remember I visited a very fine professor, I won't give his name, at the University of Foggia in southern Italy. And Foggia sits in a round space of wheat fields, 3,000 square kilometers. That was a swamp up to the 19th century. It was a swamp. So, and he, after he had talked to me and I have told him what I think about, he asked his pilot, who does aerial reconnaissance of the ground, and he allowed me to ask his pilot. When I asked his pilot, what did you find? He said, we found under the soil some 300 Roman estates and 2 towns, 2 small cities we have never heard of before. And I asked the pilot, how can you explain this? And he said, oh, there was a big economic crisis. I said, but how can the crisis cover 300 estates and 2 cities under soil? and turned the territory in a swamp. So for them, the question was absolutely new. The idea to think of catastrophe was unheard of. You had to do it in a Marxist way, so to speak. So if there was a crisis, then it was an economic crisis, and an economic crisis could do anything you wanted it to do.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's see what else we have here. Because the Londonium and Ludenwick slide is also here too. Well, we have the churches, everything you talked about.
This is the churches. I mentioned the great Krautheimer, and you can see here how he's seen the parallels between the 4th century to the very left and the two churches in the 8th century, and then he compared the 5th century, second from the left, with the 9th century, second from the right. I only added the third type of churches, and so I can now write a full history of church building, basing, of course, on Krautheimer, but by deviating from Krautheimer, by looking at the churches stratigraphically and not chronologically.
Mm-hmm. We have more.
Yeah, this is the solution. So you can see the latest church with the 3 apses. This was done after the 190s, after the small catastrophe with the plague and the Antonine fires of the 190s AD. In counting from top down, 890 AD. These are the last church types. So they have them 6 and 10s, and the bottom 2 lines, they are original Krautheimer, of course. I just put his images that are chaotically dispersed over his text that nobody reads. I colored them, I put them in a table. He did not put them in a table.
Mm-hmm. We have more here.
Do you
That's again.
do you relocate the chronology of Pontius Pilate to the 10th century?
No, not. I forgot to correct this. Paul and Pilate and Jesus. That's 8 stratigraphically. That's after 700. It's not after 1. It's not after 1. It's after 700, and stratigraphically. And this latest church development you have seen of the 6th and 10th century, that's a stage reached by Justinian, under Emperor Justinian. That's, I think, the first version of this church you have in the Nia church in Jerusalem, a huge church, more than 100 meters long. It was not found by the Israeli archaeologists until a few decades ago. They could not find it, so it was wiped out in the catastrophe. So the question is maybe the question we can ask here: why would people invent a date 1000 AD, 1000 after Christ? Okay, we didn't touch this. We only know that already in the 11th century, Michael Psellos in Constantinople and others, but very, very few people were working on this sequence as we know it today. Rome in the beginning, Constantinople. Rome means imperial antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, dominated by Rome, 4th to 6th century, dominated by Constantinople, and then 8th to 10th century dominated by Germanic cities like Aachen. And so this sequence is a very old one, without me being capable to name the individual authors and to give the sequence of development, but it's more or less around 1200. It's complete, and you all understand there were no scientific methods to control it. So my idea is that we have Christians before this catastrophe of 930. We have Christians since 730. So we have Christians for 200 years. And there's one book in the Christian Bible that's the book of Revelation. And in chapter 20 of Revelation, you have this story that that an angel will chain in the time of Jesus, will chain the devil, and after 1,000 years he will unchain the devil, and that will be the final battle of Megiddo, of Armageddon. And my assumption, but it's a rough, crude speculation. Cannot have no means to prove that. My assumption is that the decision for a year 1000 AD was a theological decision. That the catastrophe in the 10th century, that was the unchaining of the devil that was mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so the probably written by a Jewish author on the island of Patmos, and basing on the tradition. Again, we don't have many other authors anyway. So in the Bible, so the apocalyptic texts in the Bible, they deal with real catastrophes of the past, like the Exodus catastrophe. And in the time of Christ, these real catastrophes of the past, they were turned into prophecies of something that will happen in the future. And then something happened in the 930s. Big, global, up to the Yucatan. We didn't mention this here.
Yeah, we didn't
big,
go there.
and so I think it was not far-fetched to say, aha, this was the day of the Lord. This was the day that Satan was unchained after 1,000 years, and now we start counting from 1,000 AD, though we are only in 1000 AD, some 270, 260 years after Christ. Speculation.
So you believe that
for it.
Paul's, based on the evidence you have, you believe that Paul, the apostle, wrote his authentic letters in the 8th century?
I have no quarrel with the experts. So there's a debate of if 40% or 50 or 35% of the letters are authentic, and I can imagine that. I'm very sure that the man was real, that the man was traveling, and I tried to prove it by the non-Christian sources that we now do not take into account because they are dated in the 4th century or they're dated in the 8th century, and they are not looked at because people say that date I don't like. If it's 800, if it's 350, I cannot explain anything of these years to explain Paul. I accept these positions, but I asked the scholars, how do you explain this year 700 or 800 or 350? Where do you learn it from? And then they usually say, I learn it from the textbook. I learn it from a coin catalog. And I said, how do we know that this chronology stands up to scientific scrutiny? Let me point to one problem. Most of the data I'm discussing with, they are dendrochronologists. And I'm dealing with mainstream and with dissident dendrochronologists, brilliant people.
So we have
I asked them a very simple question. I said, you have a sequence of 2,000 years, let's say from 2000 to 0 back, from a forest. Put the sequence on a piece of paper and put to verify it, to reproduce your result, put me out of the 4,000 Roman cities, put me one, not 100, not 50, not 10, not 5, put me one city that has for the 1,000 years a sequence of tree rings, put them side by side and show me how they match.
So
this was never ever done, and this cannot be done because people try to do it. What they would have to do in a city like Rome, they would have to take beams from imperial antiquity, 1st to 3rd century. Then they have to take beams from the 4th to 6th, and then they have to take beams from the 8th to 10th century. But in these centuries, the second part, late antiquity and early Middle Ages, there are no buildings no ruins of buildings out of which they can take the beams. So we have never ever reproduced a tree ring sequence from a forest. It's difficult enough to do that, to put that together. We have never put it side by side with just one city and show the match. It was never done.
So I want to thank Rex Profanus for $4.99. This is the question he wanted me to put up on the screen. Jacob, can you ask Gunnar who he believes would have carried out this obfuscation of history? People, families, institutions, any suspicious culprits in his point of view?
I work under the very simple assumption: do not count on planning, on attempts to falsify. Not at all. I start always with the assumption of innocence and then of ignorance. And the moment we do that, I think we can get very far if we have a guide we can follow. And that guide is stratigraphy. And that guide we did not have until, let's say, 1900. Even the best stratigraphies we have, they were done after the Second World War. So we are just into 70, 80 years of very fine stratigraphies. And these archaeologists are doing usually a great job. I admire them a lot. And in the older days, they still try to pamper over hiatuses of a few hundred years. Today, more and more, they just write into the excavation reports, we don't understand why there is nothing here between 200 and 900. You see it more and more. There was no planning. And again, it's a very tricky sphere we are talking about here. The only history book mankind had up to the 19th century, 18th century was the for the time up to let's say 100 after Christ was the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Judeo-Christian text. So whenever people start making theories about bad intentions and bad practices, they will blame these authors. But these authors, they did not know better. That's all I can say. They worked with chronologies because you rather work with a wrong chronology than with no chronology at all. And only since, let's say, since a century, we have the possibility to test the chronology. We dig down, we are in the year 1000, and we dig down a little bit, and suddenly we are in the year 200. And we're surprised. Well, what's going on here? Only archaeology gave us this tool. And only archaeology will continue to give us this tool. And that's why I say, yes, there is innocence, there's ignorance, there is even the text, the consecutive texts covering 1,000 years, they have many falsehoods, but I would not call them falsifications. Let me take one example. The great Celtic hero of the British Isles, Arthur of Camelot, King Arthur of Camelot. He was dated in the 6th century. He was fighting with Romans and with Germanics, with Germanic people, Saxons. And so this is impossible. Rome was already out, and the Saxon tribes were in for much too much time. And so this wonderful story was thrown out of the history books. And because of chronologies, say in that time, in the 6th century, we do not have the ability to show that. But I proposed, look in the 1st century BC, the end of the 1st century BC. You have the most famous Celtic ruler on the British Isles. His name is Atze, two th and e, Atze of Camalodunum, Atze of Colchester. This Atze of Colchester, I think that's Arthur of Camelot, but nobody will take this into account. But he lived 700 years in our chronology. He lived 700 years earlier than the legendary Arthur of Camelot. But if I look at the stratigraphy, what they call 6th century, and what Atze of Camalodunum is 1st century BC, they are just 2 or 3 centuries apart, though this story was still known. And again, you can see that when the authors of the Arthur legend are called falsifiers, and they're called falsifiers and bad people in the scholarly literature, I said, wait a minute. Don't throw out the story because it doesn't fit your chronology. Maybe you find a stratigraphy, a hard evidence that fits the story.
So that would mean that King Arthur lived in the BC era. So this is like, instead of him being after
at the time of Augustus, yes.
Okay. So instead of him being after Jesus, he's before Jesus.
Yeah,
I remember that there's an Arthurian text that claimed that, I forgot which one it's called. It might be the Vulgate cycle, or the history of the. Oh, sorry, or it could be in Geoffrey of Monmouth. I don't remember who said it, but it says that Merlin lived during the time of Julius Caesar. And I'm like, what you're saying kind of reminds me of that text. Like, there are some chronological contradictions within the Arthurian text that places certain characters throughout time.
And we have a similar problem with the greatest seafarers in the history of mankind, the Vikings, the Scandinavians. We learn that they forgot to sail. They forgot the square sail for 700 years. Okay. And I say, no, they didn't forget the square sail for 700 years. How could they? So Strabo mentions them in the 1st century. And he describes their ships, and he describes their sails, how they come to bring gifts to Rome. And then he said they sail back to Denmark. He doesn't say they row back to Denmark, they sail back to Denmark. So nobody knows why they cannot sail for 700 years. And I say, the 700 years they cannot sail. These years are empty, and the moment you take the empty 700 years out, the Vikings look like serious people and not like ignoramuses, as we paint them now. So as the Arabs are thought to have forgotten to write and issue coins, so the Vikings are thought to have forgotten to say. So in these areas on the fringes of the empire, the scholars make the most daring and the most bizarre assumptions to obey the chronology and not to look at the stratigraphy.
Professor Heinsohn, you brought up too. I don't know if I have the slides ready, but Millefiori, blown glass. Did not the Vikings have the same?
Oh yes.
Geology also.
I'll tell a story about this. So in nearly every Viking city, you have the Millefiori cubes, small cubes, and it makes a problem for the historians, because we are between 700 and 900 after Christ, and these Millefiori cubes that were used in the 1st, 2nd century after Christ, so 700 years early. So what's their idea? They say, yes, the Vikings, they sailed, no, they rowed, then they sailed again. After 700, they sailed up the rivers, and they started excavating the ruins until they came down to the mosaic floors, and they broke out these little cubes and brought them back, and turned them into pearls, polished them round, or let them square, whatever. So I asked 2 or 3 of the Scandinavian excavators if they ever found mortar on the cubes, because if you break cubes out of a mosaic, you will have remains of mortar on these stones. You have to clean them thoroughly to turn them into pearls. And they never heard the question before, this guy I have in mind. And he said, no, they're all clean. So they started thinking they cannot come from an excavation. But so they made the Vikings into archaeologists to explain why they had these absolutely clean cubes to turn into jewelry for the women.
Jennifer Salves, thank you for the $5. She says, I just tuned in back at the start. Thank you for this.
Mm-hmm. I want to see what else I have here, Professor Heinsohn. There's a lot of slides here. We talked about this, the dating of the mosaics, Milifori glass, Frankish rulers building classical Roman architecture much later in Germany.
Also,
I've read this stuff, and it's just I'm encouraging everybody that's on this listening, or people that listen later, to go to QMag. We'll have in the description.
Yeah, the link's in the description.
Yep. Look at this stuff, and also, you gave the conference at the Planet Amnesia conference in Toronto in 2016. That video really, it's about an hour and 15 minutes. He really explains this stuff quite well, and it's very easy to understand. Again,
nice to hear. I never looked at it. I was sick when I gave
video.
the lecture.
I've looked at it, and it has about 22,000 views to date. I think it is. At one point, it didn't. It was from 2016. That video can really concisely explains it. I still want to encourage people to read Creation of the Gods, your book, Creation of the Gods. You had talked about that at the Toronto conference. This material is available if you go to the QMag link.
Let me say one word about the creation of the gods. It was a book, the last book in this field I wrote when I had the final catastrophe as the catastrophe dividing the Bronze Age from the Iron Age. So in the BC period, something like 600 BC. So the catastrophe of the 930s was not on my radar at all at this time. And I know the leading Polish excavators who worked on this. And so when they found that all of their major villages or townships went down around 930 after Christ, and many were discontinued, some were continued, were rebuilt, and completely different sites were begun to be built. They were surprised. These archaeologists were surprised. They had not expected it because they believed there was not a single source. It was closest to us in time. Imagine we are talking 930 after Christ, and they were just shocked that there was not a text they knew that would mention that catastrophe. Then I dug out three or four texts, two German, one Arab, and another one. And the Edda in a way, but the Edda already needs quite a bit of interpretation to tie it to this catastrophe. Mm-hmm. So there are very, very few texts. So the hit was so profound, and the elimination of scholarship was so profound. I just give you an example of celestial globes. Romans had celestial globes, and the latest celestial globe we have in a museum is in Mainz in Germany. It's dated 230 after Christ. And then before we have globes again. In mainstream chronology, it takes from 230 to 1450. In my chronology, it still takes from 930 to 1450. So half a thousand years until we reach the knowledge, the astronomical knowledge that existed already in antiquity, a very long time. So the loss of knowledge was enormous. The loss of population was enormous. In Rome, the loss of population, I would say, conservatively estimated from 400,000 to 20,000. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So from 20 inhabitants, one survived. Hiroshima is harmless. Forgive me if I make such a comparison, but is harmless compared with that death toll.
Right.
So and I had a fallout with quite a few friends and colleagues who had decided no catastrophe in the first millennium after Christ. They had just taken the decision, and I had it taken with them. So in the creation of the gods, I didn't know anything about this catastrophe.
Right.
And
Right.
then since 2013, it's nearly a decade. I'm following it. I'm searching for it, and I'm looking for material to illustrate.
I remember from your papers, you've talked about problems, anomalies in ancient Egyptian chronology, such as the Egyptians having sometimes more advanced technology in an earlier period, and they somehow forgot about it, and in a later period they start regressing when they shouldn't be. Could you talk about some of that?
I try to remember some interesting points. So let's take ships and river-going ships and Mediterranean-going ships. They in Egyptian chronology, they disappear between 1200 and 300 BC. So they disappear for 900 years. We believe the Egyptians went back to swimming by hand and feet. So this looks like a fallback technology. How can it's like the Vikings forgetting the sail for 700 years. And of course, again, the question was, is this a problem of chronology or is it a problem of hard evidence? And then it could be shown that the 1200 date that separates 700 years from 300 BC, that date stratigraphically immediately preceded the time of Alexander the Great or of the Ptolemies. It was the 4th century. So they did not forget to sail or to row for 900 years, but they again had suffered by modern chronology that had nothing to do with the time reckoning of the ancient Egyptians themselves. I'm slowly asking you about our time planning here in this interview. How much concentration will you still demand from me?
So we have 2 super chats here.
Okay.
$1.99 from Rex Profanus.
Okay.
Super chat for John. Jennifer Salves, $5. Thank you. Ask about carbon dating for John. No name. Yeah, okay. So these 2 people are super chatting for someone else, in which he okay, that's not the right one. Hold on a second. Gunnar doesn't touch carbon dating, which makes okay, here we go. Here's a better one. John O'Neill Given says, what is Gunnar's stance on carbon dating? That's the question.
I have known quite a few, and I still know quite a few carbon daters, and they're very outspoken ones. And the most outspoken, they call carbon dating a prostitute. You can make it do whatever you want. That's not my position to carbon dating, but I'm the only method I can trust in a way is dendrochronology if it's only asked to go back to something like 700 after Christ. So I can see dendrochronology. Let's say you begin from a known date, let's say 1100 after Christ. Okay, and you find wood in a settlement, and you dig down, and you may come back to the early Middle Ages, and that's where it stops. And I think in this period, 700 to 1100, 700 to 1200, in this half millennium, dendrochronology really shows what it can do. And then some of these dendrochronologies, of course, say that goes together with C4T results, or it goes against C14 results. I'm not interfering. I'm not mixing myself into these debates.
Okay.
Okay, Sean, do you want to?
Yeah, I was saying we can wrap it up. We've almost been on for 2 hours. I told Jacob we could probably do it for 4 or 5 hours, with as much information as there is.
Well, if
Yeah.
Gunnar would like to
Really,
do
there's a lot. I mean, I have contact with people within the. I mean, he goes back to Chronia. There's a lot of information, a lot of papers out here that a lot of people probably haven't read, because I was reading on Velikovsky and through the Thunderbolts group, which is how I came across Gunnar Heinsohn, through Charles Jananthal, which is how I familiarized myself with all this information. There's a lot to it, but again, it makes more sense. It makes sense to me, and it solves a lot of enigmas from the recent past, and even from maybe further back in the past, that we just couldn't put our hands on. And it's really taking a different approach, an interdisciplinary approach, to solve some of these enigmas, questions, problems, etc. I appreciate your time. I told you, you're one of my heroes.
I appreciate your
You have
time.
a lot of courage to talk about stuff like this in the first place. But like I said to the audience, there's a lot to it. It takes a person that has a high amount of intellectual responsibility to even compile this information. So again, I'd like to thank you, Professor Heinsohn. I will thank Clark Welton also. I'll put
Very much so. Where would I be without Clark?
Yeah.
He was free of charge. He never charges me anything. He's doing this editing since I think at least 2 decades now.
So Dr. Heinsohn, at one point, if you're willing to, I'd like to.
Okay.
I'd like to do another much longer interview with you on the BC era. I think that's fascinating.
It is.
Okay. Yeah, the Sumerian Chaldean question is and there are many personal stories involved with the leading people involved of Sumerology, and so it's and the ways I was treated at the conferences and so on. It's quite funny. Was painful, but in hindsight, it's also quite funny the way I was treated. And, of course, I'm still. Okay, gentlemen. Maybe this last slide, I say one word.
Okay.
So you see a 2nd century aula for the ruler on the left, and then on the right you see a 9th century from Charlemagne in Aachen. Okay. What is interesting in the 9th century building, it's not so much that it's very similar to the building 700 years earlier. The 9th century building, and that's shown by very smart archaeologists in Germany, in Aachen. They say, I have to say one thing before, of Charlemagne, we have only the palatial complex, ruins of the palatial complex, and his famous octagonal church that is today quite well intact. We have not a single house for his servants. We have not a single palace for his noblemen. We have no residential quarters, nothing. Only this complex. And the archaeologists know it, and they're desperate, desolate, that they do not know where his people could live, under the sky or wherever. But what they figured out is that this building, dated 700 years after the left building from Cologne, sits in a city quarter that was built 150, 170, 160 after Christ. So it's dated in the 9th century. But out of the Roman city of Aachen, they cut out a quarter that's called an insula in Latin. So 2 blocks, 2 insulae they cut out, and they built this imperial or magisterial complex right into the Roman city. So I tell them, you cannot find residential quarters of Charlemagne because you found them. They're sitting just around in the quarters just around, because this building is built in the 2nd century quarter, and the other 2nd century quarters are the quarters where his subjects have been living and dying. Okay, so much, so good. Good luck and goodbye.
Well, thank you for joining us, Professor Heinsohn. This has been a pleasure. And I'd like to have you back at some point.
Okay.
To expand on other parts of your work that we haven't discussed yet. So I'm just going to play this outro.
Okay.
Then we can talk privately just for a moment.
Yeah.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you for watching this video from the Var Valley Podcast. If you enjoyed watching this video, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click on the notification bell. This way you'll be notified if there's an upcoming live stream or if a video has been released. Thank you.